I largely acclimated to writers like Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn as a young man because I was kind of sensing as a young person there was something dramatically wrong with my country.
Right.
And as I have grown as an adult, these problems have continued to grow more acute. And so it seems to me this is as much an internal battle of human conscience as it is a lot of other things happening.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, a man who dominated the latter part of the 20th century when I was reading him, a man who wrote nonfiction and fiction, who wrote from history, his history. And I welcome someone to help me tell that story because here we are at war with Russia in some fashion. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was at war with Russia in another fashion in his lifetime. He first served the country, and then he fought the country. I welcome Richard Reinsch, the editor-in-chief of Civitas. This is a think tank at the University of Texas, as well as a publication, Civitas Institute. I recommend highly, and Richard has done us a favor of writing a review and an analysis of a recent collection of Solzhenitsyn's speeches, remarks, entirely after he was exiled from his mother Russia. He did return after the fall of the Soviets, and yet still all these decades later, there is the compelling need to understand what Solzhenitsyn was telling us about his country and about our country as well. Richard, congratulations and a very good evening to you. Who was Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn? What do the young people need to know of our memory, 20th century men that we were? Good evening to you.
Good evening to you, and thank you for having me on your program and for the opportunity to talk about Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was born under the Soviet Union and served the Red Army, was in East Germany serving in 1945, had been fighting the entire war when he was sent to the Gulag, in effect to Soviet prison camps for, in effect, cracking jokes about Joseph Stalin, for making light of the tyrannical ruler of the Soviet Union. And he went to spend from 1945 to about 1953 time in what became known as the Gulag, the Soviet prison camp system. He served in Siberia, various other places. He was in what is now Kazakhstan for a while, which was at the time a Soviet state, and then also kind of spent some time in exile, you might say, inside the Soviet Union, not allowed to return to his home, the region around where he grew up, and suffered tremendously, and suffers tremendously in the camps, and comes out of that experience very much a changed man, which he writes about. He goes in kind of an arrogant young officer who had been brutal at times in the war, and through a period of a path of suffering inside the Gulag and a path of learning from the suffering about what it means to be a human person, under God, and to think about human responsibility and human virtue amidst everything that the Soviet Union had done to his country and to himself and to his fellow inmates. He changes. He has a profound spiritual experience, and then he gets out and begins to write about it. And it's, what we know in the West right now, the most profound literary output from that experience is the Gulag Archipelago, which was first published in 1974, portions of it in Paris, in Russian. And then from that point forward, Solzhenitsyn's life begins to change dramatically in terms of the blowback inflicted on him by Soviet authorities.
The book that I first read was Solzhenitsyn's book about Ivan Denisovich, a Zek, that's what they called the men who were condemned, the men and women, a Zek who went through one day of extreme cold and extreme hunger and extreme desperation, got through one day. I remember I wasn't prepared for it, but as I read it, I not only became hungry and cold, I marveled that this was a science fiction story. He had to be making it up. What's your memory of reading that book, Richard?
I've read that book multiple times. The first time was in a seminar when I was an undergrad. And then I had experiences after that, which, I think a lot of people who have gone on to read in depth about Solzhenitsyn start with that short story. It, was published during sort of a period of, we might say, relative openness under Khrushchev. And he thought, mistakenly, that the book was an anti-Stalin tale. It was sort of about Stalin's brutality. But the book was deeply anti-communist and anti-Soviet. And as I remember reading through the book, it's a testimony to the human spirit because Ivan Denisovich is under tremendous stress in this one day we experience it. The cold, as you mentioned, the brutality of the system he's operating in, and yet his spirit is not broken. And that becomes, I think, something that the testimony of man's spirit, and which is then a testimony to human freedom and human conscience, that becomes Solzhenitsyn's sort of gateway into the West. The book became sort of an international literary event at that time, and it was an open scandal inside the Soviet Union.
What I remember particularly about it was how it was necessary to be fastidious in their endeavor,
Mhm.
do everything precisely as if they were creating, oh, I don't know, something of a genius product. In fact, they were, I think, cutting wood or doing something mundane.
Building a wall or something, yeah.
Yes, and how those who were not attentive to the details of their day withered and died, and that it was necessary to focus on your work that day and to focus on the food that you had, the little that you had. It was extremely impressive. I had no preparation for it. Did you, Richard? Did you know what you were going to read when you started it?
No, only through there's various sort of or say prison memoirs, Darkness at Noon. Whitaker Chambers, of course, Whitaker Chambers never was in the Gulag, but he writes about the inhumanity of the communist system. In terms of an experience of someone inside the Gulag, it was unique and arresting. You're right.
The Gulag itself is a semi researched and greatly remembered experience. Again, I tell an experience that I remember when I read your essay, Richard. It took me back to it, which was an anecdote that those of us in the Gulag were eager for an atomic war that ended the planet because we'd be free.
Yeah. No, that is an amazing observation. There's also Solzhenitsyn saying later in some of these speeches, the occasion of my piece was Notre Dame Press bringing out his exile speeches and speeches he gave after he was exiled from the Soviet Union in 1974 till he returned 20 years later. And Solzhenitsyn says, when we were in the camps, we looked with a certain amount of hope, with a certain amount of, would you be sort of freedom's champion, this champion of the human spirit? And Solzhenitsyn said when he, I think he's still in the camps and learns of a visit somehow of the British Prime Minister to the Soviet Union, who gives, some comments. And Solzhenitsyn was struck down by the comments. He was brought low because they were so banal and weak and sort of refusing to really defend the West against the Soviet Union and sort of muddling over things. And this is an experience that will trace Solzhenitsyn's observations of the West for most of his life, is looking with hope to the West and being frequently disappointed in how it confronted Soviet communism.
The title of the book from the University of Notre Dame Press is We Have Ceased to See the Purpose. It's a volume that has been annotated by one of Solzhenitsyn's sons, Ignat Solzhenitsyn. We're going to turn to Solzhenitsyn thrown out of the Soviet Union in 1974, moving to Vermont, a small town in Vermont, and his measure of the West, his disappointment of the West that he'd venerated when he was in the camps. Richard Reinsch, who is writing up a new book, a collection of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's remarks, speeches, addresses, Nobel Prize address, after he was thrown out of the Soviet Union in 1974. Exiled is the polite way of putting it. And he retreated to Vermont, where he started to write about his experience in Russia and what Russia had gone through in the 20th century. It's important to recover that this is the Cold War. There was never a moment on television, in the movies, in books, in comic books, when the moment couldn't be called up that the world would end because of atomic weapons. Never a moment. That is somebody who grew up. I was born after the war, and it dominated the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. War at any moment. Solzhenitsyn understands that, but at the same time, he's gripped by what he experienced in Russia when he wasn't free and what he viewed of America's way of dealing with freedom. The West is what he called us. Richard, I remember being puzzled about Solzhenitsyn's, what you'd have to say, unhappy opinion of the West. What was it? What did he find that was inadequate to his vision when he was in the Gulag?
Yeah, and thank you. Great question. And I think this also has immediate resonance ongoing with our moment, because it's the inability, I think, of the West to properly come to terms with communism's end and what it means to have defeated communism that sort of prepares the way for a lot of things that have happened in the West the last 30 years, to see this as just a triumph of capitalism, as just a triumph of unlimited human freedom, of capital D democracy, of humanitarian progressive democracy, something like that, that it's all sort of tied into man's cleverness that defeated this evil of communism. And Solzhenitsyn says it's really not that. Communism moves forward by, he says, almost a spiritual heresy, a conquest of the human person in the name of perfection, in the name of bringing an end to misery through this grand ideological project. And the West, he thinks, should just understand that through its own reserves of philosophy, of religion, of political liberty. It should just get that. And yet he says that it doesn't. Why doesn't it? And he says, actually, the East, the Soviet East, the communist East, and the free West, he says, are gripped by sort of the same malady. And that malady is materialist humanism, to use his term. And that materialist humanism exalts man to the nth degree and sort of removes the West from the primary ideas that that shaped it and formed it, that being the experience of Athens and of Jerusalem. And when you take that into account, you start to see how the West, in this quest that it had been on, he says, from the Renaissance and from the Enlightenment, couldn't actually grapple with the total evil that the Soviet Union represented. And then he starts to point in ways that make people very uncomfortable in these speeches towards problems in the West, towards the inability of the West to defend its own institutions, towards its leaders struggling to defend the virtues that had shaped and formed their countries. He talks about the inability to punish terrorists attacking Western nations. That happened in Europe in the 70s and 80s. He talks about the inability of the West to defend its public culture, to have sort of an understanding of the importance of work and of family and of the goods that man should be properly attuned to. We were kind of being led astray. And so for all of these reasons, the grand statement of this is in the Harvard address in 1978, where he really formulates this into a full statement and does so at sort of what is seen as the pinnacle of American higher education, is largely excoriates the West. But he does so, I point out, he does so as a friend. And friends tell the truth because they need you. And Solzhenitsyn needed the West to vindicate its own spirit and its own true self in order to overcome communism. And he was fearful, not that we didn't have enough tools or prosperity or ability to do that, but that decline first begins in the human heart and the human spirit. And that was his fear.
He was keen on Dostoevsky's Demons. Why, Richard?
Yes. So Demons, Fyodor Dostoevsky, the great Russian 19th century novelist, was also an astute observer of ideology. And Russia in the last half of the 19th century was gripped by socialist, utopian, nihilist ideologies, particularly in its upper and educated classes. Dostoevsky's novel, The Demons, sometimes titled The Possessed, is really the grandest literary study we can read of how ideology destroys a human person. And in that novel, we're kind of in a provincial town in Russia. And what we might think of as kind of intellectual characters use their powers to sort of destroy this town, turn people against one another, even convince someone to murder another person who's believed to be no longer trustworthy in their sort of socialist revolutionary cell. And there's this inability. We see people unable to repudiate this, to strike it down, even though they have the opportunity to. And Solzhenitsyn sees this as sort of writ large application to situations in the West in the 1970s, and cites it. He cites it one time in giving a speech in Zurich. I want to say 1974, and in other places he refers back to Dostoevsky. And so, and it's also one of the best Dostoevsky scholars currently writing now at Northwestern, Gary Saul Morson, has done much the same kind of work in publications like the Wall Street Journal, The New Criterion, talking about Dostoevsky's The Demons applying to America in the summer of 2020 and going forward in various ways in which we are encouraged to repudiate our own heritage and history as Americans. So this is all very immediate and current, even though we're drifting with these ideas that have been extant in the West now, for over 150 years. They come forward in various new, applications.
It's surprising to me in my seniority, Richard, how I did not understand this in the 20th century. And it's now very clear cut to me about the spiritual shallowness of the West and the need to leave the planet in a better human being than you were when you arrived. Does that surprise you? We just have a few seconds. Does that surprise you that you now get it and you didn't?
No, I mean, I largely acclimated to writers like Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, even perhaps as a young man, because I was kind of sensing as a young person there was something dramatically wrong with my country,
right?
And it's just ever since as I have grown as an adult, these problems have continued to grow more acute, and so it seems to me this is as much an internal battle of human conscience as it is a lot of other things happening.
It's a pleasure to speak to you because I've been reading your product for some time and talking to your authors and understanding that you have a view that is consistent with the think tank view, but at the same time, there's a spirit of discovery here. How do you think of Civitas Outlook? What are your ambitions for it?
Civitas Outlook is an online journal published by the Civitas Institute, which is a conservative think tank at the University of Texas, Austin. And at Civitas Outlook, what we are doing is publishing leading authors, leading academics, thinkers, public intellectuals, constitutional law, political questions, free markets and economic questions, and also what we call the pursuit of happiness. That is, Americans in civil society coming together and self-governing themselves and doing good things for their communities and for other people. And in that regard, our essays are accessible. They are 1,500 words, but they are also, I think, laden with principles, foundations, and applications to contemporary questions, problems, discussions. And so, my gift is to be the editor of that and to bring in great authors, many of whom you interview on your show. We have Richard Epstein, we have John Yoo, we have Yuval Levin, we have others. Sam Gregg is another one who stands out, who have come in and given us a lot to think about. The Civitas Institute, which publishes us, is a think tank doing a lot of standard think tank things, but also in addition to policy, I think is also focused on getting right fundamental ideas, getting right the principles that are the basis of our American society. That is to say, the freedom and the responsibility of American citizenship. And so we are trying to present that picture. We are not in Washington. We're in Austin, Texas, at the University of Texas. And so we have this tremendous opportunity to bring together a lot of great resources and use them to think about what's happening in our country and hopefully to improve people's thinking and also their reading list for how they might approach these questions.
I am puzzled how it is to work today in an atmosphere, a partisan atmosphere of such dangers and toxicity and plain poison. Do you experience that as an editor dealing with the authors sometimes who've been wounded in other publications or tell anecdotes that are scary so you never want to publish again? What's it
Yeah.
like?
Well, I think a lot of us have our war stories and our scars from various things that have happened to us along the way. But I think it also, these things, if they're taken rightly, can be a spur to better writing, better thinking, and also greater courage. It seems to me as I encounter our writers and as I think about our efforts on campus, it really is a time, and I don't say this to say it's an exceptional time and all the rules be damned, we're going to do whatever we want. But it is a time to state arguments and to state first principles and to think about what it means to live as a citizen in a constitutional republic with tremendous problems and in a country where we have had ideas that I think have been at war with a free and responsible society and at war with our Constitution, to sort of investigate those and to investigate them, criticize them, and to try and propose an alternative. We have our systems of higher education since the 1970s, it seems to me, have been acutely oriented towards progressive thinking, economics, culture, policy. And we are, there are a number of
So
institutions.
diplomatic, Richard. That was wonderfully diplomatically put. Please continue.
And we are, to put this succinctly, saying there could be another way. And in fact, much of American history is built on very different principles, and they're good. And let's think about how we apply them now, and let's continue forward in this experiment, this grand constitutional adventure, which does not presume that the answer to every question is sort of a comprehensive egalitarianism or a kind of moral relativism, but that there are, in fact, ways to live your life as an American with our own resources that are good. And here's some things that we think you should read.
You're on a campus of a great university that is endowed happily, and a lot of alumni, a lot of their parents, everybody invested in University of Texas prospering. At the same time, you see other institutions under great stress, under great pressure. Does it worry you, Richard, that campus has become a target for everyone?
Well, I think one question that's emerging is when it comes to higher education is, which universities want to come out from sort of this spell of ideology, and what are the universities, in particular the elite universities, that choose to stay under it, that don't have the courage or the sort of wisdom to kick it off. And as I see efforts across the University of Texas, Austin, a number of other schools, the University of Florida is one, my alma mater, the University of North Carolina is another one, other schools and universities putting into place institutions that are going to be formidable on campus and formidable but I think in a liberal sense, the best sense of the liberal term of let's think, let's go back, let's read the old books, the old texts, and let's start to think, read, and discuss again as citizens and as equals, not as ideologues. That is a new hopeful turn within higher education that we're experiencing. I work for the Civitas Institute. We're not formally in the classroom. Our mission is to talk about the ideas that have made our country what it is, how wonderful it is in our constitutional order and the freedom and virtue that we have as Americans. And we're endeavoring to do that and come alongside and try and propose these ideas as ways to move forward as a country. So there are some hopeful turns. I can't really speak for Columbia University. I can't speak for Harvard or Penn or other places that seem to be awash what I would just call anti-liberal ideology that does not respect the students and does not respect our society at large, wants to impose something that would undermine it. And I think now they are starting to see even the country at large. I mean, most people have no connection to these universities, but are saying enough is enough. You're now becoming a problem for our country. If we think about the last election, we had a lot of Silicon Valley CEOs for the first time move to the right politically. And according to one of them, the reason why he did so was the graduates being sent to his company from high-level institutions wanted to destroy his company, did not respect it, and saw it as their mission to impose some sort of a revolutionary ideology inside their company. And they're saying, time out, enough is enough. We've got to do something here. We've got to take action. And I think that spirit in our country is new, and it's something that has not happened for decades, really since the left took over the institutions of higher education 50 years ago. But there's always time to rethink things. Human nature is resilient, the human spirit is resilient, and we have a lot of resources in our history to draw on in this country and try and put things back rightly. But it is going to take time.
Richard Reinsch is the editor-in-chief of Civitas Outlook. The website is easy to maneuver and it's easy to access, civitasinstitute.org. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.